The winter morning arrived cold and grey over Vatican City, the kind of February day where the ancient stones seemed to absorb the chill and radiate it back into the air. Tourists and pilgrims moved through St. Peter's Square, bundled in heavy coats, their breath forming small clouds as they gazed up at the magnificent basilica that had stood for centuries as a symbol of faith and power. The fountains in the square continued their eternal dance, water cascading despite the cold, and pigeons huddled together on the colonnades designed by Bernini hundreds of years before. Inside a hotel room not far from the Vatican walls, Muhammad Ali stood before a mirror, attempting to knot his tie. His hands trembled as he worked the silk fabric, the tremors making the simple task frustratingly difficult. He had been the fastest heavyweight champion in history, hands that could throw combinations so quick they seemed to blur, hands that had signed autographs for millions of fans around the world. Now those same hands shook with a palsy that doctors were beginning to understand but couldn't cure. "Let me help you with that," Veronica said softly, moving beside her husband. She had watched him struggle with these small tasks more and more frequently over the past year. The man who had been so fiercely independent, who had proclaimed himself the greatest of all time, now needed assistance with things he had once done without thinking. Ali allowed her to adjust his tie, watching her reflection in the mirror. "You know," he said, his voice slower and softer than it had been in his prime. "I've been thinking about this meeting all night. Couldn't sleep much. You? Nervous?" Veronica smiled gently. "You've never been nervous about anything in your life." "That's not true," Ali replied, turning to face her. "I was nervous before the Liston fight. I was nervous when I refused to go to Vietnam, knowing what it would cost me. And I'm nervous now. This is different than boxing. This is about something deeper." His manager, Herbert Mohammed, entered the room carrying a folder of documents. "The car is ready whenever you are, champ. The Vatican has confirmed everything. 15 minutes with the Holy Father as scheduled." Ali nodded slowly, then sat on the edge of the bed. His mind drifted back through the years, through all the moments that had brought him to this point. He thought about his childhood in Louisville, Kentucky, where he had been born Cassius Marcellus Clay, Jr., named after a white abolitionist his parents admired. He remembered the day his bicycle was stolen when he was 12 years old, how he had gone to a police officer named Joe Martin, who happened to run a boxing gym, how he had declared through angry tears that he was going to beat up whoever stole his bike. "You better learn how to fight first," Martin had told him, and so began a journey that would take a skinny kid from Louisville to the pinnacle of athletic achievement and global fame. He remembered winning the gold medal at the 1960 Olympics in Rome, standing on the podium as the American national anthem played, feeling pride in his country despite the segregation and discrimination he faced at home. He remembered returning to Louisville and being refused service at a whites-only restaurant even though he wore his gold medal. The humiliation of that moment had burned into his soul. Then came his professional career, the rise through the heavyweight ranks with a style that defied conventional wisdom. Heavyweights were supposed to be slow, plodding punches. Ali danced, he moved, he made fighting look like an art form. "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee" became his motto, and he backed it up with performances that left audiences breathless. The upset victory over Sonny Liston in 1964 had shocked the world. Liston was considered invincible, a terrifying force who had destroyed former champion Floyd Patterson twice. But Ali, still known as Cassius Clay then, had been fearless. He had taunted Liston, predicted the round of victory, and then delivered on his promises. At 22 years old, he was the heavyweight champion of the world. The very next day, he had announced his conversion to Islam and his association with the Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad. The reaction had been explosive. Many in America viewed the Nation of Islam as a dangerous, radical organization. Ali's decision to change his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali was seen by some as a rejection of his country. But for Ali, it was about finding his identity, about connecting with a faith and a community that gave him strength and purpose. Cassius Clay was a slave name, he had explained countless times. Muhammad Ali is a free name. It means beloved of God and elevated. That's who I am. Then came 1967, the year that changed everything. Ali was at the peak of his powers, having defended his championship multiple times against top contenders. He was making more money than he had ever dreamed possible. And then he received his draft notice for the Vietnam War. Ali's refusal to be inducted into the armed forces was based on his religious beliefs and his opposition to the war. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," he famously said. "No Viet Cong ever called me a bad name." But his stance went deeper than that. He believed the war was wrong, that young men were dying for reasons that had nothing to do with protecting America, and that as a minister in the Nation of Islam, he was entitled to conscientious objector status. The backlash was immediate and severe. Ali was stripped of his heavyweight title without losing in the ring. His boxing license was revoked in every state. He was convicted of draft evasion and faced 5 years in prison. Suddenly, the man who had been on top of the world found himself unable to work, facing prison time and vilified by much of the country he had once represented as an Olympic champion. Those years in exile, from 1967 to 1970, had been the hardest of Ali's life. He was in his prime, the best years of an athlete's career, and he couldn't fight. He made money by speaking at colleges, where his opposition to the war resonated with young people protesting against the conflict. But he missed boxing, missed the competition, missed the roar of the crowd. When the Supreme Court finally overturned his conviction in 1971, Ali returned to the ring. But he had lost 3.5 years, and the sport had moved on. Joe Frazier was now the heavyweight champion, and their first fight at Madison Square Garden in March 1971 was billed as the fight of the century. It lived up to the hype, a brutal 15-round war that Frazier won by decision, handing Ali his first professional loss. Ali sat on the hotel bed, his hands still trembling slightly, remembering that night. The loss to Frazier had devastated him, not just because he lost, but because he had been so certain he would win. He had learned humility that night, learned that confidence alone wasn't enough, that the years away from the ring had taken something from him that he couldn't get back. But he had persevered. He fought his way back to another title shot, this time against George Foreman in Zaire, Africa, in 1974. The Rumble in the Jungle, they called it. Foreman was younger, stronger, and had destroyed Frazier in 2 rounds to win the championship. Everyone expected Foreman to do the same to Ali. Instead, Ali had produced one of the greatest upsets in sports history. Using a strategy he called rope-a-dope, he had let Foreman punch himself out for 7 rounds, then knocked him out in the 8th. At 32 years old, Ali was heavyweight champion again, 7 years after being stripped of the title. The third fight with Frazier, the Thriller in Manila in 1975, had been even more brutal than their first encounter. Both men had pushed themselves to the absolute limit of human endurance. After 14 rounds of savage fighting, Frazier's corner had stopped the fight. Ali had won, but he later said, "It was the closest thing to death I've ever known." Looking back now, Ali wondered if that fight, and all the others where he had absorbed tremendous punishment, had contributed to the tremors in his hands, the slowness in his speech, the symptoms that doctors were beginning to associate with Parkinson's disease. "Champ, we really should get going," Herbert said gently. "We don't want to be late for the Pope." Ali stood up, steadying himself. Veronica handed him his coat, and together they left the hotel. The drive to the Vatican was short, through streets that had witnessed 2,000 years of history. Rome in winter had a particular beauty, the ancient ruins and Renaissance palaces taking on a timeless quality in the grey light. As they approached Vatican City, Ali felt his nervousness increase. He had met presidents and kings, had been received by leaders around the world. But this was different. Pope John Paul II was not just a political leader. He was the spiritual shepherd of over 1 billion Catholics, a man who had survived an assassination attempt just months earlier, a man who had stood against communist oppression in his native Poland. Ali had studied the Pope's background in preparation for this meeting. Karol Wojtyła had been born in Poland in 1920, had lived through the Nazi occupation during World War II, had seen friends and neighbors murdered simply for being Jewish or for resisting the occupation. He had studied for the priesthood in secret because the Nazis had closed the seminaries. After the war, when Poland fell under Soviet control, he had continued his ministry under a regime that was hostile to religion. When Wojtyła was elected pope in 1978, becoming the first non-Italian pope in 455 years, it had sent shockwaves through the communist world. His visits to Poland had inspired the Solidarity movement, which would eventually help bring down communist rule in Eastern Europe. In May 1981, a Turkish gunman had shot the Pope in St. Peter's Square, nearly killing him. The Pope had survived, and later visited his would-be assassin in prison to offer forgiveness. This was a man who understood sacrifice, who had stood for his principles despite enormous pressure and danger. Ali felt a kinship with him, despite their different faiths and backgrounds. The car entered Vatican City through one of the ancient gates, and they were escorted to a side entrance of the Apostolic Palace. Vatican officials, dressed in traditional clerical attire, greeted them formally but warmly. They were led through corridors lined with priceless art, past Swiss guards in their colorful Renaissance uniforms, through rooms that had witnessed centuries of church history. Finally, they arrived at an antechamber outside the Pope's private audience room. The space was elegant but not ostentatious, with marble floors, tapestries on the walls, and religious paintings that dated back hundreds of years. A large window looked out over the Vatican gardens, where even in winter the carefully maintained grounds showed signs of life. Ali sat in a chair, his hands resting on his knees, trying to control the tremors. His daughter Layla, who had accompanied them on the trip, sat beside him. She was only 4 years old, too young to fully understand the significance of this moment, but she sensed her father's nervousness and held his hand. "Daddy, why are we here?" she asked in her small voice. Ali looked down at his daughter, and his face softened. "We're here to meet a very special man, baby girl, a man who helps people, who teaches people about love and faith, just like your daddy tries to do." "Is he nice?" Layla asked. "I believe he is," Ali replied. "I believe he's one of the good ones." Veronica watched her husband with his daughter, and her heart ached. She knew Ali was struggling with his health, knew that the tremors were getting worse, that his speech was slowing down. But she also saw the strength in him, the determination that had carried him through so many battles. He wasn't fighting in the ring anymore, but he was still fighting, still trying to make a difference in the world. The door to the audience chamber opened, and a Vatican official gestured for them to enter. Ali stood, taking a deep breath. Layla held his hand as they walked through the doorway. The audience chamber was smaller and more intimate than Ali had expected. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a room that was warm and inviting, despite its formal purpose. Religious artwork adorned the walls, including a large crucifix and paintings of various saints. A simple desk sat in one corner, covered with papers and books, and there, rising from a chair to greet them, was Pope John Paul II. The Pope was 61 years old, his hair white, his face lined with the experiences of a remarkable life. He wore simple white papal vestments, and his eyes held a warmth and intelligence that immediately put visitors at ease. Despite the assassination attempt just months earlier, he moved with energy and purpose. Mr. Ali, the Pope said in accented English, extending his hand, welcome. It is an honor to meet you. Ali stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached out to shake the Pope's hand. Holy Father, he said, his voice soft, the honor is mine. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped. Two men from completely different worlds, connected by their shared humanity. Ali felt something stirring in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear or nervousness anymore. It was something deeper, something spiritual, and then, without planning it, without thinking about it, Muhammad Ali's legs began to bend. The man who had stood tall against every opponent, who had refused to bow to presidents or generals, who had sacrificed everything rather than compromise his principles, slowly lowered himself to his knees before the Pope. The room fell completely silent. Veronica gasped softly, her hand going to her mouth. Herbert and the other members of Ali's entourage stood frozen, unsure what to do. The Vatican officials exchanged glances of surprise. This was not part of the protocol, not something that had been discussed or arranged. Little Layla, still holding her father's hand, knelt beside him, not understanding why, but following his lead. Pope John Paul II looked down at the kneeling champion, and his eyes filled with tears. In his long life he had met countless world leaders, celebrities and dignitaries. He had received the homage of millions of Catholics around the world. But there was something profoundly moving about this moment, something that transcended protocol or ceremony. Here was Muhammad Ali, a devout Muslim, a man who had stood against his own government for his beliefs, a man who had been stripped of everything he had worked for rather than compromise his faith, kneeling not out of obligation or custom, but out of genuine spiritual reverence. The Pope placed his hands on Ali's head, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. My son, he said, you are a great champion. You have brought joy to millions around the world. You have stood for your principles when it cost you everything. But remember, true greatness comes not from what we achieve for ourselves, but from what we do for others. The glory of the ring fades, but the impact we have on people's lives, the love we show, the justice we fight for, these things are eternal. Ali remained kneeling, his head bowed, and tears began to stream down his face. They were not tears of sadness or pain. They were tears of release, of recognition, of a profound spiritual moment that transcended religion, nationality, or fame. In that moment, Ali felt connected to something greater than himself, something that encompassed all of humanity's search for meaning and purpose. Holy Father, Ali said, his voice breaking, I have fought many battles. I have won championships. I have stood before millions of people. But I have never felt the presence of something greater than myself as strongly as I do right now, in this moment, in this place. The Pope helped Ali to his feet, his own eyes glistening with tears. He embraced the boxer, holding him for a long moment. My son, the Pope said, you have always fought for what you believed in. You sacrificed your career, your title, your freedom for your principles. That takes a courage greater than any shown in a boxing ring. God sees that courage. God honors that sacrifice. It does not matter what name we call God, whether Allah or Jehovah or any other name. What matters is that we live our lives in service to that divine presence, in service to our fellow human beings. They sat down together then, the formal 15-minute audience forgotten. For over an hour they talked, two men who had both known suffering and sacrifice, who had both stood against powerful forces for what they believed was right. The Pope spoke of his years in Poland, of watching the Nazis march through his country, of seeing his Jewish friends and neighbors rounded up and sent to concentration camps. He spoke of the years under communist rule, of keeping faith alive when the government tried to extinguish it, of secret masses held in private homes, of priests who disappeared in the night for the crime of teaching about God. There were times, the Pope said, when it seemed hopeless, when it seemed that evil had won. But we kept faith. We believed that truth and justice would ultimately prevail, and slowly, gradually, things began to change. The human spirit cannot be crushed forever. It always finds a way to rise again. Ali listened intently, nodding. I know something about that, Holy Father. When they took my title, when they banned me from boxing, when they convicted me and I faced prison, a lot of people told me to give in, to compromise, to just go along with what they wanted. But I couldn't do it. My faith wouldn't let me. My conscience wouldn't let me. And you were right, the Pope said firmly. A man who compromises his deepest principles for convenience or comfort loses something essential. He loses his soul. You kept your soul, even when it cost you everything else. They talked about faith, about the different paths people take to connect with the divine. The Pope spoke about his respect for Islam, about the shared heritage of the Abrahamic faiths, about how Muslims, Christians and Jews all traced their spiritual lineage back to Abraham. We worship the same God, the Pope said. We may have different understandings, different practices, different traditions, but at the core, we are all seeking the same thing: connection with the divine, guidance for how to live a good life, hope for something beyond this mortal existence. Ali spoke about his conversion to Islam, about how it had given him a sense of identity and purpose that he had never felt before. When I was Cassius Clay, I was lost, he said. I was successful, I was famous, but I didn't know who I really was. When I became Muhammad Ali, when I embraced Islam, I found myself, I found my purpose. That is the gift of faith, the Pope replied. It gives us an anchor, a foundation to build our lives upon. Without faith, we are adrift, blown by every wind of circumstance. With faith, we have something solid to hold on to, even in the worst storms. They discussed the assassination attempt on the Pope's life, which had occurred just 9 months earlier. The Pope spoke candidly about the experience, about the moment when the bullet struck him, about the surgery and recovery, about his decision to forgive his attacker. I could have held on to anger and hatred, the Pope said. But what would that accomplish? It would only poison my own soul. Forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness is strength. It is choosing love over hate, choosing peace over vengeance. Ali was deeply moved by this. That takes real courage, Holy Father. More courage than stepping into a boxing ring. I've been hit by the hardest punches in the world, but I don't know if I could forgive someone who tried to kill me. You could, the Pope said with certainty. You have already shown that kind of courage. When you refused to hate the people who took your title, who banned you from boxing, who tried to send you to prison, you showed forgiveness. You could have become bitter and angry. Instead, you continued to spread a message of faith and hope. They talked about their families, about the challenges of balancing public responsibilities with private life. The Pope spoke about his loneliness sometimes, about missing the simple pleasures of ordinary life. Ali talked about his children, about wanting to be a good father, despite the demands of his fame, and now his declining health. The tremors, Ali said, holding up his shaking hands. The doctors say it's from boxing, from all the punches I took. Sometimes I wonder if it was worth it. The Pope reached out and took Ali's trembling hands in his own steady ones. Your body may be weakening, but your spirit is strong. You have inspired millions of people. You have shown courage and principle. That legacy will outlive any physical limitation. Your body is temporary, but your impact on the world is eternal. Ali felt tears coming again. Thank you, Holy Father. I needed to hear that. They prayed together then, each in their own tradition, but united in spirit. The Pope prayed in Latin, the ancient language of the Church. Ali recited verses from the Quran in Arabic. The words were different, the languages were different, but the intention was the same. Gratitude, supplication, connection with the divine. When they finally stood to say goodbye, both men were reluctant to end the meeting. They had connected on a level that went beyond their public roles, beyond their religious differences, beyond the formality of a papal audience. The Pope walked Ali to the door, his arm around the boxer's shoulders. "Remember," he said, "you are beloved of God. That is what your name means, and it is the truth. Whatever challenges you face, whatever difficulties lie ahead, you are beloved of God." Ali embraced the Pope one more time. "Thank you, Holy Father. This has been one of the most important days of my life. I will never forget it." As Ali and his family left the audience chamber, walking back through the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, he felt transformed. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a deep sense of peace. His hands still trembled, his speech was still slow, but somehow these things seemed less important now. Veronica walked beside him, holding his arm. "That was incredible," she said softly. "I've never seen anything like that." "Neither have I," Ali replied. "I've been in the ring with the toughest fighters in the world. I've stood before crowds of 100,000 people. But I've never felt anything as powerful as what I felt in that room." The news of Ali's visit to the Vatican spread quickly through the media. Photographs of the meeting appeared in newspapers and magazines around the world. But the cameras had not been present for the most powerful moment, when Ali knelt before the Pope. That moment remained private, known only to those who had witnessed it. Yet somehow, word got out. Perhaps one of the Vatican officials mentioned it, or perhaps someone in Ali's entourage spoke about it. However it happened, the story of Muhammad Ali kneeling before Pope John Paul II began to spread, and it captured the imagination of people around the world. In mosques and churches, in synagogues and temples, religious leaders spoke about the meeting. They held it up as an example of how people of different faiths could show mutual respect and learn from each other. They pointed to it as proof that true spirituality transcends religious boundaries, that the search for meaning and connection with the divine is universal. In Louisville, Kentucky, where Ali had grown up, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about the meeting. The headline read, "Louisville's Champion Meets the Pope." The article included interviews with people who had known Ali as a child, who remembered the skinny kid who had started boxing after his bicycle was stolen. "He was always special," said Joe Martin, Ali's first boxing coach, now elderly but still sharp. "Even as a 12-year-old kid, he had something different about him. He had confidence, sure, but he also had heart. He cared about people. He wanted to make a difference." In Poland, where Pope John Paul II was a national hero, the meeting was seen as validation of the Pope's message of interfaith dialogue and respect. Polish newspapers ran stories about how the Pope had reached out to a Muslim athlete, showing that the Catholic Church could build bridges with other faiths. In the Muslim world, reactions were mixed. Some conservative voices criticized Ali for showing such deference to the leader of another religion, but many more praised him for demonstrating the Islamic principle of respect for all people of faith. Prominent Islamic scholars wrote articles pointing out that the Quran itself speaks respectfully of Christians and Jews as people of the book, and that Ali's actions were consistent with Islamic teachings about interfaith respect. In the United States, the meeting took on additional significance given the country's complicated history with Ali. Many Americans who had vilified him for refusing to go to Vietnam, who had called him a traitor and a coward, began to reassess their views. Here was the Pope, one of the most respected moral leaders in the world, treating Ali with profound respect and admiration. Perhaps people began to think Ali had been right all along. Perhaps his stand against the war had been courageous rather than cowardly. The meeting also had a profound impact on interfaith dialogue efforts around the world. Religious organizations that had been working to build bridges between different faith communities found new energy and inspiration. The image of Ali and the Pope together became a symbol of what was possible when people approached each other with open hearts and mutual respect. Universities organized symposiums and conferences to discuss the theological and social implications of the meeting. Scholars from different religious traditions came together to explore questions of faith, sacrifice, and the universal human search for meaning. Papers were written, books were published, all inspired by that brief encounter in a Vatican audience chamber. But perhaps the most significant impact was on ordinary people who heard the story. A young Muslim man in Detroit, facing discrimination and hostility in the aftermath of the Iranian hostage crisis, found strength in knowing that his hero had been respected by the Pope. It gave him hope that understanding between different communities was possible. A Catholic woman in Dublin, struggling with her faith after the death of her child, was moved by the Pope's words about suffering and sacrifice. She found comfort in the idea that her pain had meaning, that it was part of a larger spiritual journey. A Protestant minister in Alabama, who had grown up being taught that Catholics were not true Christians, was challenged by the story to reconsider his prejudices. If Muhammad Ali, a Muslim, could show such respect to the Pope, perhaps he needed to examine his own attitudes toward other Christian denominations. An atheist professor in London, who had long dismissed all religion as superstition, found himself unexpectedly moved by the genuine humanity displayed by both Ali and the Pope. While he didn't suddenly become a believer, he gained a new appreciation for the positive role that faith could play in people's lives. Ali continued his life, his body slowly betraying him as Parkinson's disease progressed. The tremors got worse, his movements became more labored, his speech became more difficult, but he never complained. He continued to make public appearances, to sign autographs for fans, to speak out on issues he cared about, and he spoke often about that day in Vatican City, about the moment when he knelt before the Pope. In interviews, at speaking engagements, in private conversations with friends and family, he returned again and again to that experience. "I've been knocked down in the ring," he would say, his words slow but clear. "But I always got back up. That day in the Vatican, I knelt by choice. I knelt because I felt something bigger than myself, bigger than boxing, bigger than fame or championships. I felt the presence of God. I felt connected to something eternal." People would ask him if he thought it was appropriate as a Muslim to kneel before the Pope. Ali's answer was always the same. "I didn't kneel before a man. I knelt before what that man represents. I knelt before the divine presence that works through all of us, regardless of our religion or our background." The Pope understood that. He didn't see it as me submitting to him. He saw it as both of us submitting to something greater than either of us. Pope John Paul II, too, remembered the meeting fondly. In the years that followed, as he continued his papacy, traveling the world and meeting with leaders from all faiths and backgrounds, he would often mention his encounter with Muhammad Ali. In 1986, the Pope organized an interfaith prayer gathering in Assisi, Italy, bringing together religious leaders from around the world to pray for peace. In his opening remarks, he spoke about the importance of mutual respect between different faiths, and he cited his meeting with Ali as an example of how such respect could be demonstrated. "Muhammad Ali taught me something important that day," the Pope said. "He showed me that courage comes in many forms. It takes courage to fight in a boxing ring. It takes courage to stand against injustice, even when it costs you everything. But it takes the greatest courage of all to humble yourself before God, to acknowledge that there is something greater than yourself. That is true strength." The Pope's words were broadcast around the world, and once again, people were reminded of that meeting in 1982. The story took on new life, inspiring a new generation of people to think about faith, respect, and the common humanity that binds us all together. In 1996, Ali was chosen to light the Olympic torch at the Atlanta Games. It was a moment of redemption and recognition. The Olympic gold medalist from 1960 now being honored by his country at the world's biggest sporting event. But it was also a moment of profound vulnerability. Ali's Parkinson's disease was now advanced. His hands shook visibly as he held the torch. His movements were slow and labored, and it took tremendous effort for him to complete the task. Millions of people around the world watched, many with tears in their eyes, as Ali struggled to light the Olympic cauldron. They saw not just a sick man fighting against his body's limitations, but a man who had learned that true strength comes from perseverance, from refusing to give up, from finding dignity even in difficulty. And many people, watching that moment, remembered the story of Ali kneeling before the Pope. They remembered that this was a man who had learned to find strength in humility, who had discovered that greatness comes not from never falling, but from how we rise, and sometimes from how we kneel. Pope John Paul II watched the Olympic ceremony on television from the Vatican. He was 76 years old now, his own body showing the effects of age and the assassination attempt that had nearly killed him. But when he saw Ali light the torch, he smiled through his tears. "That is my friend," he said to the aides who were with him. "That is a man of true courage and faith." The Pope sent a message to Ali, congratulating him on the honor and expressing his continued admiration and respect. Ali, in turn, sent a message back, thanking the Pope and recalling their meeting 14 years earlier. "That day in the Vatican changed my life, Holy Father," Ali wrote. "It taught me that faith is bigger than any one religion, that respect and love can bridge any divide, and that true greatness comes from serving something greater than ourselves. Thank you for that lesson. I carry it with me every day." The two men never met again in person, but they remained connected in spirit. When Pope John Paul II passed away in 2005 after a long illness that had left him increasingly frail, Ali was among the millions around the world who mourned his death. Ali released a statement that read, "The world has lost a great man. I lost a friend." Pope John Paul II was a man of courage, faith, and love. He stood against oppression and injustice. He reached out to people of all faiths with respect and compassion. He taught me that what unites us is stronger than what divides us. He showed me that true faith is about how we live our lives, how we treat others, how we serve God by serving humanity. I will never forget him. I will never forget the day we met, the words we shared, the connection we felt. May God bless him and grant him eternal peace. Ali's statement was widely reported in the media, and once again, the story of their 1982 meeting was retold. New generations learned about the day Muhammad Ali knelt before Pope John Paul II, and the story continued to inspire and move people. When Ali himself died in 2016, after years of declining health, the world mourned the loss of one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. His funeral in Louisville was attended by thousands of people, and millions more watched on television. The funeral was a remarkable display of interfaith unity. Religious leaders from multiple traditions spoke, including a Catholic priest, a Muslim imam, a Jewish rabbi, and a Protestant minister. Each spoke about different aspects of Ali's life and legacy, but all of them mentioned his meeting with Pope John Paul II. The Catholic priest told the story in detail, describing how Ali had knelt before the Pope, how both men had been moved to tears, how they had talked for over an hour about faith and sacrifice and the human search for meaning. "These two men," the priest said, "showed us something profoundly important. They showed us that the walls we build between ourselves, the divisions we create based on religion or nationality or ideology, these are artificial. They are human constructs that separate us from each other and from God. Muhammad Ali and Pope John Paul II looked past those walls. They saw each other as fellow human beings on a spiritual journey. They recognized the divine spark in each other, and in doing so, they gave us a model for how we should treat each other. Udaidi, the Muslim imam, spoke about how Ali's actions that day were consistent with Islamic teachings about respect for all people of faith. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught us to respect the people of the book, those who worship the same God we worship, even if they do so in different ways. Muhammad Ali embodied that teaching. He showed respect to the Pope not because he agreed with all Catholic doctrine, but because he recognized a fellow servant of God, a man who had dedicated his life to faith and service. The Jewish rabbi spoke about the universal human search for connection with the divine. Whether we call God by the name Allah or Jehovah or any other name, we are all seeking the same thing: meaning, purpose, connection with something greater than ourselves. Muhammad Ali understood that. Pope John Paul II understood that. And in their meeting, they demonstrated that understanding for the whole world to see. The Protestant minister spoke about courage and sacrifice. Muhammad Ali was willing to give up everything for his principles. He lost his title, his career, his freedom, rather than compromise his beliefs. That is the kind of faith that changes the world. That is the kind of courage that inspires generations. And when he knelt before the Pope, he showed another kind of courage, the courage to be vulnerable, to be humble, to acknowledge that there is something greater than himself. As the speakers talked, as the stories were told, as the tears were shed, it became clear that Ali's legacy was about much more than boxing. Yes, he had been the greatest heavyweight champion of all time. Yes, he had been an Olympic gold medalist, a three-time world champion, a fighter whose speed and skill had revolutionized the sport. But his true greatness lay in his willingness to stand for his principles, to sacrifice everything for his beliefs, and to show respect and love to all people, regardless of their background or faith. The moment when Muhammad Ali knelt before Pope John Paul II, that brief encounter in a Vatican audience chamber in February 1982, had become a symbol of all that Ali represented. It was a moment of humility and strength, of interfaith respect and universal human connection, of two remarkable men recognizing the divine in each other. In the years since both men passed away, the story has continued to resonate. It is taught in schools as an example of interfaith dialogue. It is discussed in religious studies classes as a case study in how people of different faiths can find common ground. It is cited by peace activists as proof that understanding between different communities is possible. Artists have created paintings and sculptures commemorating the moment. Writers have penned poems and essays exploring its meaning. Filmmakers have included it in documentaries about both Ali and Pope John Paul II. The image of Ali kneeling before the Pope has become iconic, a visual representation of respect, humility, and the universal human search for connection with the divine. But perhaps the most important legacy of that moment is the way it continues to inspire ordinary people in their daily lives. When someone faces discrimination because of their religion, they remember that Muhammad Ali was respected by the Pope. When someone struggles to understand people from a different faith tradition, they remember that Ali and the Pope found common ground. When someone wonders if it's possible to stand for your principles without hating those who disagree with you, they remember how Ali and the Pope treated each other with respect and love. The moment lasted only seconds. The meeting lasted only an hour. But the impact continues to ripple outward, touching lives, changing hearts, building bridges between communities that might otherwise remain divided. In a world that often seems fractured by religious conflict, political division, and ideological warfare, The story of Muhammad Ali and Pope John Paul II stands as a testament to what becomes possible when we approach each other with open hearts and mutual respect. It reminds us that beneath our different beliefs and practices, we share a common humanity. It shows us that true strength includes the ability to be vulnerable, that genuine faith welcomes dialogue rather than demanding conformity, and that the greatest champions are those who fight not just for personal glory, but for principles that uplift all of humanity. Two men, different in almost every way imaginable, found common ground in their shared commitment to something greater than themselves. A Muslim boxer and a Catholic pope meeting in a quiet room in the Vatican created a moment that touched the entire world. And that moment continues to shine as a beacon of hope, reminding us that love is stronger than hate, that understanding is more powerful than prejudice, and that when we humble ourselves before the divine, we discover our truest strength and our deepest connection to each other.